Let's make a Rothko together and talk about why some art gets dismissed so quickly. Today I'm recreating one of Mark Rothko's paintings using collage paper. Or at least I'm going to try. This particular Rothko sold for more than $85 million, which is enough money to make most people stop and ask, what? Why? And honestly, that's a fair question, because if you've ever looked at a Rothko painting, especially online, your first reaction might be, it's just rectangles. And visually, that's true. But one of the things I've learned as an artist is that the question isn't always, what am I looking at? Sometimes the better question is, what decisions am I not seeing? So let's talk about how you can also view simple art while you're at a museum or you're discussing it in a group of friends. The more art I make, the more suspicious I become of things that look simple. Simple recipes are awfully difficult to cook well. Simple writing is often difficult to write. Simple design is often difficult to design. And simple art is often difficult to make, because every decision becomes really, really clearly put on the paper or the canvas. There's nowhere to hide. And if you know about the 10,000 hours of mastery, you also know that people who have been doing this type of artwork for a long time can make things look very easy. Rothko once said, "A painting is not a picture of an experience, it is an experience." I think about that quote a lot because when people discuss Rothko, they often focus on what they're seeing, the rectangles, the colors, the scale, the blurriness. But Rothko wasn't trying to paint objects. He was trying to create a feeling. Whether or not he succeeded is really up to the viewer. But that was his goal. That was the goal. That is our goal as artists. One thing that's interesting about recreating famous artworks is that it forces you to slow down. When I first looked at this painting, I thought I understood it. Then I started trying to rebuild it, and then suddenly I noticed things I completely missed. The size of the shapes, the placement, the distance between the colors, how was I going to get that fuzziness, the way one color changes the feeling of the other color next to it, the amount of space around everything, and all of those invisible decisions start becoming visible on my paper. I also had the constraint of not having the exact colors, and I was trying to make a replica, and I was trying to make things that aren't easy to translate from painting to paper. For example, I tried to make sure that I could have some edges, but I can't blend those edges into the background paper. So let's do a little practice. One of the best museum tips I can give people is this. When you encounter an artwork that seems simple, don't immediately ask whether you like it. Instead, ask, what choices did the artist make? That one question changes everything, because now you're investigating and you're not judging. For example, let's look at this Rothko, and I might ask, why these colors? Why this proportion? Why are the edges soft? Why is one shape larger than the other? Why does this feel balanced? Why do the colors mesh so well together? Why does it feel slightly off balance, even though it is straight? Those questions are much more interesting than simply deciding whether the painting is good or bad, or whether I like it or I don't. Another thing I try to remember in museums is that artists are usually solving problems, even when the problem isn't obvious. Maybe it's not obvious to them, maybe it's not obvious to the time, maybe it's not obvious to us right now. A landscape painter might be solving the problem of light. A portrait painter might be solving the problem of expression. An abstract painter might be solving the problem of emotion. When you look at the artwork through that lens, you start seeing an artist as a person making decisions rather than a machine producing objects. One of our lovely collage artists from the way, way past, Pablo Picasso, supposedly said, "Learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist." And I think that that's one reason exercises like this are so valuable. Going back to the 10,000 hours of a mastery and knowing the rules, learning the rules, putting the rules to practice so that you can then break the rules and become your own person. That's how you develop your style. You recreate work, you practice, you learn, you practice again, you put on paper, paint, or canvas, and then you decide which of these rules you don't like, which of the color combinations you don't like, and you start to create your own. I also think copying artwork for study is one of the fastest ways to develop respect. Not because you have to love every piece of art, you don't. There are plenty of famous artists that I don't connect with personally, but trying to learn how they made the art or trying to recreate them usually helps me appreciate the skill, the thought, the expert skill involved. And appreciation is different than agreement. One thing Rothko understood very well was restraint. He wasn't trying to add more. He was constantly deciding what could be removed. And that is a surprisingly difficult skill. Many artists struggle with knowing when to stop. I know I do. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is just to leave things alone. As the collage is coming together, I'm realizing once again that simple looking art often asks for a lot of trust. Trust that colors can communicate, trust that composition will matter, trust that emotion doesn't always need a literal image attached to it. And that's part of the reason why Rothko remains so fascinating to people. So the next time you're in a museum or you're looking at a piece of art, I'd encourage you to try something. Find a piece of art that doesn't immediately impress you. Find something that gutturally makes you not like it, and then spend 2 minutes with it anyways. Ask yourself, what choices did the artist make? What problems were they trying to solve? What am I missing in this art? You might still dislike the artwork. That's completely fine. But you'll probably have a much more interesting experience. And if you're able, the next step in this journey is to look at the time frame when the art was made. That can tell you a lot about the limitations, constraints, and experimentation that the artist was able to put into their art. I first saw Rothko in Tate Museum in London, and it made me curious. It made me slow down. The paintings are huge, and it reminded me that art often reveals more when you spend more time with it. So I sat in the room, in the Rothko room in Tate, and just watched how other people looked at the artwork, watched how other people walked past the artwork. I watched the color combinations of what people were wearing compared to the artwork, and I just started to realize that I liked it more and more. That gave me a second step to go and think about doing more research on Rothko. Not every artwork has to become your favorite, but every artwork can teach you something. And sometimes the simplest looking ones have the most to teach. I have some new exciting news that's coming out with the little Collage Club as well. Subscribe and hit that notify button so that you are one of the first people to know when the newsletter opens. All right, I'm done. What do you think? It has definitely got a lot of constraints. The idea that I'm not able to paint and cause a little bit of that blending from the front paper to the back paper is kind of a little irritating, to be honest. But it is what it is, and I did the best I could with the constraints that I had. I'm excited to grow a creative community, and I can't wait to get started. Bye.